Thank you so much for being here, everyone, to the last and final session in track 2 of the Sacred Plants of the Americas Conference, digital edition. I'm beaming in live from Berkeley, California, also known as Wichin, Ramaytush Ohlone territory. Grateful to be here with you all, grateful to be here for this final session in this amazing conference. Major props to everyone who's made it this far. Digital conferences are definitely a marathon, not a sprint. A lot of time in front of a screen, so we're glad to be here. I'm really honored to be having a conversation today with Sitaramaya Sita, who is a friend who I've known for many years, and also truly someone who has many, many layers of wisdom and knowledge around plants and plant teachers. I'll read just a line from her bio, but truly I think the richness will come in the conversation today. Sitaramaya has traveled, worked and studied extensively in the Amazon for the past 20 years, I think much longer than that now. She's a spiritual herbalist and plant wisdom practitioner, formerly trained in the Shipibo Ayahuasca tradition. She's the founder of Plant Teachers, dedicated to cultivating entheogenic awareness, and the producer of the Visionary Convergence Conference. Sita trains, teaches, and practices to heal personal, institutional, and cultural trauma. And she firmly believes that our wounds can become wisdom. Sita also has a really fascinating life outside of the plant work, which we may touch on today. I'm really glad to be welcoming Sita to have this conversation today.
Hey.
Hey there.
Hi.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm actually a little nervous, interestingly enough.
It's okay. We can kind of start by shaking it all out. It's literally just the two of us. And then there are some dear friends who are beaming in from the internet. So
yeah. I see them in the sidebar there.
Totally. I think that you can hide it if you need to get the distraction off of your screen. But usually I've seen like a lot of really, really good feedback and conversation from folks. So it's mostly been very affirming and positive. Yeah. Well, hi, Sita. It's so good to see you. Thank you so much for being here and for joining us in this very potent final session of this 3-day conference. It's really cool that we're getting to have this conversation. And just to orient the audience a bit, we're going to talk a little bit about really broadly the collective consciousness of plants and how ayahuasca and other plants can be a gateway to experiencing other plants. And I think that we'll talk a little bit about the meta layer too, around knowledge and how we hold it and how it's transferred. And we had a conversation earlier with Glenn Shepard about how plants themselves kind of carry some level of knowledge, or you can see it at the biological level or the spiritual level or something in between. So I think we'll go a little bit deeper into that. Maybe to start, if you want to kind of share an overview to kind of orient us a bit just to your own understanding of the practice, and then I've got some questions. We can kind of do this interview style, and I can kind of like lead us. We can kind of lead each other maybe along a path, if that sounds good to you.
Yeah, that sounds great. Let's just play with it. And I just would like to start by offering thanks and gratitude to ayahuasca and to the Shipibo people and the plant and tree and fungi elders. And coming to you in this moment from the land of the Tongbe, which is part of what we now call Los Angeles County, and to acknowledge that I am a white woman of Eastern European descent, talking about a way of knowing that I learned from indigenous people. And I acknowledge that, I know just a tiny little drop, and what I am relaying is my understanding of it and not a representation of indigenous knowledge. And I acknowledge the lessons that I've learned, and I vow in this conversation to be as respectful as I'm able to be, and to be open to continuing to learn. And I just, I was so humbled. I was in the session, and there's a woman from the Tucano tribe who said, somebody who is not indigenous will never be a traditional healer in that sense. And that's so true. And that's such a good reminder for me that I know what I know, and I bring what I bring in my own life experience. But to just be very careful and very cautious about how I speak of these things. As I said, I feel so grateful to have had the experience to be able to be to to have spent as much time as I have with the Shipibo people and in the Amazon and in that awareness. And in these days, more and more, I feel that I'm able to apply that here with these plants and in this setting where it's so needed. And so I just wanted to frame my participation in this conversation, and also to acknowledge, like, what is the reciprocity here? Like, what is it? What is my responsibility? And that's still a process that's in discovery for me. And though I have, first came to ceremonial work in 1998, I'm still figuring it out. And so that feels really good to not think that I'm done and that I know everything, or maybe, too much. So yeah, and I think to also speak to this idea in traditional Amazonian medicine as I know it and as I understand it, and in the plant kingdom and the categorization of plants, I think it's really valuable and has a practical application in my life. And so while, unlike on Zoom where we can see the people that are in attendance, we can't. So I'm just going to invite whoever is joining us from wherever you are, whether you're inside or outside, perhaps to look around. Maybe there is a plant in your environment, or maybe there's one that you want to bring to join the session so that we can actually have that experience of communing with the plant as we talk and explore these topics, and see what that's like. And just to say, behind me are two very dear friends that have been in my life since 1998. So these two big mamas are dear friends, and then there's some master plants, and so I feel really fortunate to be able to be in my office surrounded by the plant people. And so if you have a plant person in your midst, maybe take a moment to acknowledge it or invite it to the conversation. So I think I'll leave it at that, and just answer whatever questions come up to the extent I can within the topic outlined in the talk.
Yeah, thank you. I think I mentioned this in our prep call, but I've recently become a plant person in the sense that I am able to keep some plants alive. It was a challenge for me for a long time, but I've been really working on it. So I'm really glad to have an opportunity to kind of learn and to hear about, the many ways that we can deepen our relationship. So maybe I'll start with kind of a cosmological question, which is to say, you kind of touch on this in the description, but it kind of goes to our understanding of our place in the natural world. And this idea that there's one version of reality, kind of the usually seen as like the Western or individualist or maybe rationalist version, colonialist, even white supremacist, even version of reality, where we have like a human-centric knowledge system, right? Where like humans are at the top of the food chain, and that everything is here for our consumption and our evolution. And it kind of goes without saying that that way of being has had some pretty intensely negative impacts on the earth and on other humans and other plants and animal relatives. So I wonder if you could speak to just broadly how your understanding and relationship with plants and what you've learned has helped you understand, or what you understand of the cosmology that places humans in relation to plants, and what it means to have a place in an order that isn't at the top of some hierarchy. What does that mean to you?
So thank you for that question and for that backdrop to the question. And I think when you said this, like this top down, and there is an implication that top down is somehow better. And if we think about the neuronal network in our brain, which sits in our skull at the top of our body, in a way, it's a bit of a weight, right? Where plants, their neuronal networks are underground in their roots, right? So already we couldn't be more different, but yet we have these same capacities for communication. And again, we think with this mind that can get us into a lot of trouble, that way of doing it is the only way. And so I can't talk about this without talking about ayahuasca and my experience with ayahuasca that opened up a capacity for a different way of knowing. And more commonly referred to, not just with ayahuasca, but with other psychedelic experiences, there could be the experience of synesthesia, like where you're seeing a musical note or you're tasting a color. So already we're outside the bounds of our conventional senses, and we're starting to operate, outside the limits of the default mode network. And a great way I can explain this is through some of the art that comes out of ayahuasca experiences. So whether it is the kuna, which are the lines that we see in the artistic expressions of the Panoan language group, which are the Shipibo as well, or the more fantastical images and cosmological images that we see in the paintings of Pablo Amarengo or some of the new global ayahuasca art. So we look at it and we can't explain our vision. We can't explain it, but something happens and it feels really profound and it feels bigger than us. And maybe we're in, the ocean of oneness or awareness or a deep inner knowing. And then we look at a painting and we're like, oh, wait, that's it. But we can't language it. And I say, hooray that we can't language it, because already we're being taken away from this top-down system that says that language in the brain and this way of being is the only way or maybe the best way. And so I always feel like when language fails me, great, because then I'm sourcing something else. And in my understanding, ayahuasca is a way of taking a plant so that we can see. So the unaya, the curandero is a doctor. So the patient comes and maybe they're troubled in the heart, or maybe they're troubled, in their physical heart or their emotional heart. And they go to the doctor and the doctor drinks the ayahuasca and has a vision and says, oh, okay, I can see what's happening here, and I can see the tears in the fabric, and I'm going to sing and I'm going to mend these, and there's this wonderful plant that's going to really help you. And either that plant is going to come in through the song, or maybe I'm going to prescribe that you diet with this plant, or maybe I'm going to prescribe that you take a bath with this plant to help your heart or to help your leg or to help your mind. And so in that sense, the ayahuasca is this gateway to this very rich pharmacopoeia, a tiny, tiny little drop of which I think I understand, that is then categorized in this system of the teacher plants and the healing plants and the ornamental plants and the plant universes. So to get back to this way of your question, having to do with my experience, essentially, what I can say is ayahuasca blew my mind, opened my heart, and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, wow, I can use my heart brain. And then I find out, okay, so the heart is actually sending more messages to the brain than the brain is to the heart. And so everything's starting to change in my personal world and in the way that I'm living my life. And it isn't something that happened from going to the jungle and drinking ayahuasca 10 times. This has been a process over 20 years. But every step of the way, I understand a little bit more that, I can walk down the street in New York City, and now I'm looking for the weeds that are popping up through the cracks, right? And it has a whole different meaning. It's wow, okay, you're here. Or the mosquito that lands on my arm, okay, hello, you're here. So it's all part of this living matrix that I feel wow, I get to be part of this, as opposed to in some way.
Yeah. I wonder, so you said the word language a few times, and we've heard from a few folks today about this idea of communication, and language and communication are not exactly the same thing, right? There's this kind of head-brain version of language and the words that we use and the way that we as people at this moment over the internet are communicating with each other. But how might you characterize, or how might you explain or understand the communication that comes from plants? If it's not from language, if it doesn't come through our kind of cognitive, intellectual mind, how in your experience do plants communicate with us in other ways?
Well, I can't necessarily speak for everybody, right? But what I can say is you're sitting there with a plant right now, and like you just looked at it and smiled. So something happened there. And so it wasn't in language, but it was an event. And I turned around and I'm like, oh, okay. Now, if I were to drink ayahuasca and be in a meditative state with this plant medicine, perhaps there would be images or awarenesses or insights that I then translate into language, because it's all I have. But I might know, and I'll give you one example for myself. I was in a ceremony, and I had chronic reproductive health issues my entire life. And in this ceremony, the best I can say is that the plant showed me, okay, I had another ovarian cyst, and it had been a chronic condition in my life. And it was then verified by an ultrasound. And then there was the surgery schedule, but then this plant came to me, ayahuasca, to diet, to heal myself. And the end result was me saying the word ayahuasca, or being able to communicate that so I could facilitate getting this particular vine and doing all of that. But it was this knowing that this was something that I could try. And it was something that was coming to me in response to this call from my body and my condition, where there was like a tear in the fabric of my well-being. Like there was something that was just out of whack. And so I'm not really sure how to put that into language. So like that's one of the ways. And then the other way is in dieting. What happens is we abstain from certain things for a period of time, and we take a plant. And then what happens is later, if we diet well and we're receiving the songs from the medicine, it comes through in a song, right? Or we're receiving a song. And I'm like, wow, I can really feel the morosa, or I can really feel the ohe, or whatever the plant or tree is that's coming through. And it can be a body sensation. And I know I've talked to lots of people who drank ayahuasca, and they feel like, oh, I feel like something's coming in, or she's coming in and she's cleaning everything and fixing everything. So that's a form of communication. It's not in language. And I think it tends to be more in sensation and like more in sensation and more in vibration and more in vision. Although I believe that ayahuasca is brilliant, as are, many of the teacher plants. And they've actually talked to me and like said words like, it just requires a shift or something like that. I'm like, who just said that? So like, while I can't communicate like a plant, I think plants can communicate like humans when we need that big pop on the head, because we're not getting it any other way.
Right. Give you these like subtle, embodied, kind of more cosmic cues until we're like, nope, you just got to hear the words sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Or at least I've had to hear the words sometimes.
For sure. No, I think it's a thing too, because I feel like, especially for, and kind of maybe as a segue into another level of this conversation, I feel like a lot of people, I'm thinking especially, people in my generation that grew up from, very, very young with the internet and being like, well, all the information is at our fingertips. We can just look it up and it's easy to find. And I feel like the idea that there's a different way of learning, of gaining knowledge and experience through like literally building a relationship with what we're taught, from like the meta superstructure of society, is a totally unconscious, or at least like non-intelligent being that we can just, harvest and extract. So I wonder if you could speak to, because especially you've had now, over 20 years of experience going to the Amazon and engaging on your own path, as you say, to the extent that you have. What observations do you have about, how we hold knowledge that we then receive? Because, we receive this knowledge, whether it's in an embodied way, an experiential way, or a visual way, sometimes really literally as words. And, we're flawed creatures, humans. We have our own filters and our own perceptions and biases. And I wonder if you could speak to like how you have held knowledge and what is it that has turned that knowledge for you into wisdom? Like how has it activated for you in a meaningful way?
Yeah. So I will touch a little bit on how it was for me. So the first time I went to the Amazon, there was no internet, there was no Google, and it was like a wing and a prayer and a lot of faith. Like, okay, I really want to go do this thing called drinking ayahuasca in Brazil, as it turned out. But over time, like my maestro, like very rarely answered questions. And it was very interesting. Like and at one point, what he said to me, he's like, if I tell you this, it's something I told you. But if you come to know it, then it becomes knowledge and wisdom. And it was a really hard road because I was very analytical. Give me the answer and I'm going to take it down the notes in my notebook and I'm going to get it all. And then I'm going to go back and study it. And even at one point, I remember I had like 3 pages of notes and I was asking all these questions and he just looked at me and he just like said, we're done. I'm like, but I'm not finished. I have 2 more pages of notes. And it was just like, no. And so for me, I'm so glad because it really called me to proceed at the pace of the tortoise. And my whole life had been in fast forward. And I think that is in part a product of modern culture and, growing up, here in the United States as I did, and, the ever advancing technology, even though we weren't at the internet yet, it was still pretty fast moving. And so I am forever grateful for that big slowdown because I found that like this idea of like, I know a lot of stuff, like maybe I felt like I was learning less, but I was really getting it. And I was really allowing it to seep into the fabric of my being. And it took a really long time. And at the time I would get very frustrated by it. Looking back, I'm now really grateful for it. But this way of knowing was also required cultivating patience and presence and belief and faith. Like, I mean, I walk over and turn on the light switch. I have faith that the light is going to come on. I don't question it every time I go. Is the light going to come on? But in the beginning, it was like, am I really going to have a vision? Am I really going to be able to commune with these plant spirits? Am I really going to learn something? Am I really going to be able to do this or that or have this or give this? And until like it actually became not something I took for granted, but like, okay, I have faith and I have faith in this medicine and I have faith in the plants and I have faith as a result of having an experience over and over again. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Totally did. And because it does go to this kind of like meta question. There's someone who just put it in the chat, which I really appreciated, the struggle of being overly analytical about medicinal plants. And I think about, I'm like sometimes way too an analytical person. So I really feel that. And I think the ability to surrender into and intentionally bring yourself into a different way of knowing is a really critical part of like the whole understanding of the relationship. Now, there's a little bit of a shadow side to that, I think, which is enhanced under kind of their current economic post-industrial environment, which is to say, we hear a lot about, bypassing and what it means to have like these forms of knowledge that then don't always integrate with what we see as real life. And, I see a lot of people who, they might be there in certain aspects where they have a certain like level of knowledge because they've been able to tap into this level of, non-intellectual or non-analytical wisdom, which is real. And sometimes there's a lot of difficult, this wonderful plant cycle over that sometimes it's also difficult to kind of bring those lessons into, you know, the material world, which is like full of contradictions and full of, you know, 400 years of post-colonial reality. So I guess my next question is around like, how have you not just experienced this embodied, you know, knowledge outside of the analytical frame, but like, how have you brought those lessons into your real life? What have you learned, and what have you learned to do, and what have you learned to avoid, you know, in this process of bringing this knowledge out of the cosmological self into the world that's full of, you know, bigotry and money and, you know, pain and oppression? Yeah. It's a big question, but I'm really curious.
Yeah, it is a big question. And, you know, I'll just touch on this. I'm not going to say a lot about it, but as you know, Izzy, like pretty much for a significant period of time that I was traveling to the Amazon, I was also doing advocacy work on behalf of people on death row and people who are facing capital murder charges, and working with disenfranchised populations. And so it was really like this, like I would say, oh my gosh, I'm going and like earning money and then spending it to get to the Amazon so that I can experience my death. And then I'm being of service to people who are facing their death every single day because they're imprisoned, you know, by the government of the United States of America, right? Like, so it really was about like, wow, what can I learn from that? And the practical application for me has been in how I have created a life in connection as much as possible, right where I am in Los Angeles, with like this application of myself as part of this natural world, as part of, you know, the Gaian ecosystem, growing my food, being aware, being less consumptive, you know, being very mindful about the source of everything. And sometimes I do better than others, but just raising my own consciousness about my behavior, about my words, as much as I possibly can. And also this concept of giving back, right? And tithing, and not just taking, but doing what I can and being open to learning from systems that have worked really well for a really long time. And to not to do so from like a patronizing way. So it's very complicated. It's not like a slam dunk. So it requires thoughtfulness every day. And in fact, I even right here, right now, after you know, listening and attending some of these sessions, I'm like, who am I to even talk about this? Yeah, I have 20 years in, but I'm still a white woman of Eastern European descent. Like really, so like cultivating that respect and honor, and then saying, okay, but there are things right here that I gratefully have been able to apply the technology I learned in the Amazon right here, in terms of plants I work with, in terms of the soil, in terms of even the way my garden looks. It doesn't look like traditional North American, because it actually it is not the most productive, but like actually putting into practice things that I've learned as much as I possibly can. And then I think, again, what I have learned in working with the plants, like applying that practically, you know, I'm just about concluding in the advocacy and the legal work, but really trying to apply that every single day in whatever way I could. And then I think the other thing is, if I am living my life like in the medicine or a spiritual life, like it's not a switch that gets turned on when it's time for ceremony, right? Like, how do I actually like call myself to it all the time? And so I can say I try to be as conscientious as I can and to not kid myself. And, Yeah, so that's just to do the best I can, to be mindful, do the best I can, to be respectful, and to be grateful for the opportunity to have had this like crazy, wild, cross-cultural experience in my lifetime. Like, wow,
Yeah.
from the inner city streets of Philly to the Amazon. Like, who'd have thought, right?
Totally. And I just want to like really reiterate and honor this because I mean, I'm a bit biased, as you know, and for the audience to know, I'm also an attorney, and or actually, I'm really fascinated with how these like larger structures end up governing our lives and having so much of an impact on our lives, and how we kind of, you were talking about this like kind of Gaian way of being, and how one kind of reclaims and retakes some level what precious bit we can of sovereignty over our own experience, knowing that these much larger systems that have been set in place and have hundreds of years of momentum behind them so often define our lives. So I think, you know, in so many ways, the work that you've done with people on death row and over the course of your career in that way, like, you know, there's only so much we can do as people, as individuals within these larger systems. And I think it's fascinating and awesome to see how, you know, something that is so, you know, it can be so like outside of the material world does bring you back to something that's so literally life and death material, you know, something that's so visceral in that sense. And I think that's a good lesson for the audience to pick up, you know, just to really think about like, what are the real world ways in which the things that we learn in all of these precious ceremonies and all the time we spend in with these medicines, and like, how do we apply that to seeing not just the sickness of ourselves or of our friends, but of like these larger systems? And what does it mean to be looking, you know, generations in the future, 100 years in the future, and how that healing can look like from a systemic perspective? It's really inspiring. So I want to get a little bit into some of the questions that folks have from the Q&A, because there's some really
one thing before we move on to that.
Absolutely.
So really, like, as you were talking, I'm like, wow, like, so like in a way, like this was my integration. Like I didn't just leave the ceremony and then go back to my life. Like, right, it's like it's all one. And one of the most important experiences I ever had early on, I was working on behalf of a client who was schizophrenic, and just multiple generations of trauma and abuse. And and I was still fairly early in my healing of my own trauma and abuse and my wounds. And in this ceremony, it was like there were, I don't even know how many conversations going in my head at once. And I'm like, oh, that's what he's experiencing. And in that moment, like that really set the course for me in a really powerful way of this idea of transpersonal experiences and how the plants got me there. Because even though I was having this experience, I'm like, oh, right, but that's what's happening there. And so it really helped me personally. And I felt fortified and more capable of being able to hold space for people who, both have, been involved or been, had heinous things done to them and have done heinous things, what, we call heinous, but are all trauma related. And so so it really helped me to show up for that in a really powerful way. And obviously I didn't go around saying, hey, everybody, I'm drinking ayahuasca. But what I did was I took the message from that medicine experience and just went about my business of working with people in extraordinary circumstances.
Yeah, no, it's really, and I like the way that you frame that, where it's like, well, you don't need to tell everyone like ayahuasca is the reason I'm doing this, but yeah. You can have that level of motivation, and then you can apply that motivation to as you said, like the real injustices. And then as you become more aware of these cycles of trauma, it becomes really easier to see where things, how things end up the way they are. There's that phrase, hurt people and healed people heal people. And like, it's much easier to see those concepts, once you have a sense of what this intergenerational process can look like. Not to say that it's totally the fault of the system or totally the fault of the individual, but maybe some complex series of factors that really are at play there. And to me, that brings up that really, it opens up an opportunity for a different way to think about punishment and accountability, and how we think about accountability as a society and how we do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully we do it from a more and more ever emergent, compassionate perspective, rather than, punishment, but like a
Yeah.
restoration to wholeness, and like a healing and a coming together. And yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple really good questions. There's one more, maybe more challenging one, and an easy one. I'll start with the more challenging one.
Okay.
Um,
Ready. Okay.
so Holly Flammer asks, do you think it's bad juju, as I've been told, to grow sacred plants in our homes? Can we grow them ethically outside of places that they normally would not grow, outside of their natural habitat?
Yeah. Um, I've never heard about it being bad juju. So just saying that, honestly. And for me, there's certain plants that will and won't grow. So for me, the plants that grow here are some specific medicinal plants that are healing to the body, and some of the teacher plants, because it just made sense. So I dieted at one point for a year. You can figure out what that means, the restrictions and all this, for a year continuously. And I didn't have access to the plants. So what I did was I grew them, and that was my relationship. How do I create the conditions for this plant to continue? And it did, to this day. And that was how, whatever that 1 year was, I think it was in 2004, it's 2021. So progenies of those plants are still here. Other people have died at that plant. And I feel it has been a way to pass that knowledge on. And because in the tradition in which I learned, it is a lineage-based system. So like whatever has been shared with me, through a direct transmission, I then share with others, and the plants are the conduit for that. So I feel so grateful that I've been able to grow some of these plants here. I understand there's a big question about commodification and transportation of plants out of their original areas. And with all due respect, I also recognize, if we look historically at the history of this planet, I guess you could say, and we look at opportunistic plants, and like the reality is that, ayahuasca has left the jungle. And I don't think it's just people doing that. I think the plants have something to do with it as well. So I think if within the framework that we're working or practicing, we're authentically and truly checking with our teachers and checking with the plants, and it is within that framework something that is, let's say, permissible or auspicious, then yes. And if not, I think it's really important to just, maintain, a good dose of humility and, checking in. Like, am I saying yes because I want it that way, or is it truly a yes? And being willing to monitor ourselves. So it's a bigger question than just like juju in the house, or it's a bigger question, because there's also the question of, if this plant comes from, because there are some plants actually that if I wanted to diet them, there's no way under the current conditions that I would be able to diet it at home. I'd have to go to the jungle and diet it. There's others that I can come back and I can diet here. And I respect that. And it's just the way that it is. And I don't say, oh no, but, it's just how it is. So and again, this is in the framework and in the tradition that I'm experiencing, and other tribes and other indigenous groups might be different. Maybe you never diet outside the jungle. So that's the best answer I have for that.
Good. It's an interesting question, especially in an environment where we're dealing with like very real habitat destruction and climate change. I think that this kind of question, I mean, it's in some ways it's a microcosm of a much larger question, which is like, what does it mean for these plants to be spreading? And I personally take a bit of the approach that you do, where I'm like, oh, I don't think I'm the one telling the plants what to do here. I feel like that there's a level of agency that I think, partially because of our, kind of more cognitive, analytical, rationalist way of thinking in the West, especially in the global North, tends to forget that the plants have their own sovereignty and consciousness. And I think there's a way of holding that while also holding the reality of, as you said, commodification, the risk of globalization, and what happens when, especially now, we're in this period where we're kind of entering this new phase where there's a lot of money and there's a lot of interest in what these things can do and all of that. And I think it's really important, as you said, to be thinking both with humility and also with accountability to what it is we're actually asking for, what we're actually like moving toward. Because I think that,
and you know, and on that note too, I mean, I think that as far as I know, I do my very best not to consume things that are wildcrafted, like that no one's going into a jungle and harvesting anything for me. And, you know, I have a conservation project, the 1 Acre Project, where I privately have been conserving 70 acres of the Amazon rainforest personally, just so that the old growth trees don't get cut down. And I grow plants there. I mean, during the pandemic, unfortunately, they were all poached, but the reality, like, I'm trying to do my part too in not just taking and, you know, and that's another question about, you know, plantation grown plants and, you know, how that has like brought up a little bit of an industry and, you know, so that's another topic perhaps. But I really, you know, I can say I'm not drinking ayahuasca that's coming from, you know, 100-year-old vines that somebody went into the forest and cut. Now I have, when I have been willing to trek into that forest and be in that remote spot, but, you know, otherwise I'm not doing that. And for me, that's something that feels right in my heart to not, you know, be taking in that way, unless I'm willing to make the trek into that spot and be there in the dirt and the, you know, all of the conditions that come with that. And it's been years since I've been in those conditions, actually.
It's beautiful because that also ties to one of the things you were saying earlier around the importance of sourcing. And you weren't just talking about plant medicine at that point. You're like, where are the things that I'm consuming coming from broadly? Like, you know, us as like American consumers, like that's a really big question that like sometimes people are really afraid to answer. And I really appreciated what you just said around, well, if I'm going to be going to the place where this particular thing, you know, the particular plant is being sourced from, it comes with all of the conditions that it comes with, you know, that's a really important thing. And I think going back to what I was saying around knowledge, like, you know, it's kind of, it feels easy to get just the bite of knowledge without all the conditions nowadays. And I think what people forget is that there's actually wisdom in experiencing those conditions, to the extent that you were saying, you know, your teacher was like, you're not taking notes here. You know, it's like, it's what it is that you're experiencing as a person in this space. And I think that's a really, it's just a cool and important lesson, I think, especially for people who are new to the field, who are trying to figure out, well, how do we integrate all of this plant consciousness that we're suddenly exposed to into what's going on? You use the word integration. I think that's really on point.
You know, I'd like to just offer another little snippet on that about what comes with it. So the last time in Peru that I drank ayahuasca from vines that were like this big and 100 years old, I also had an infestation of chiggers in my body. If anybody knows what isango or chiggers are, from like here down to my toes, it's like just like this rash of like these insects that get under your skin and are incredibly itchy with no remedy, like for a week. So like that's what, you know, not glamorous, right? Like it's not glamorous. Like this is I'm drinking ayahuasca and then it's making the sensation even worse and amplified. But like that's what I mean by, you know, because we can say, oh, you know, I did this and I did that. It was, you know, like these, you know, fairy tale versions. But the reality is that for me anyway, and it was good for me that it came with that, because retrospectively, like I loved it. Right? Like here I am, some remote place that's, you know, not connected to anything. And I'm like, what's going on with my body? I can't stand it another minute. And then it's another day and another day and another day. So like, that's what I mean. And you're right. Like, I'm not going to get that from reading an article on the internet. And I'm so glad that there was no internet, because I don't know, maybe I would have been one of those people who defaulted to the internet. So Yeah.
I'm so glad that you have this knowledge to carry and share. I have one last question for you, which Joseph Mays asked, and he said, it's not a fair question, but I think it's a good one.
Okay.
Do you have a favorite plant or one that's on your mind at the moment?
It's not a fair question. So here's the thing. I married ayahuasca, but it's a combination of two plants. So there's that, but I also just love ayahuasca, the ayahuasca vine. But what I would say is actually my main plant is this plant here. Can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
This is a cutting of morosa, and that plant that I mentioned that I dieted in 2004. So this is a cutting from those original plants still going. This is a baby. So I think, so it's not this plant, it is the world of this plant. So when you think about the plant, it's the world of the plant, and the plants have their own universes. They have their own universities and hospitals, and it's an entire universe. So for me, the universe of Morosa, which is the underwater realms and the realms of the mermaids and the rocks and, you know, the water that can wear away stone over time or be soft and gentle or be a tidal wave, is pretty, you know, so there's that. So I think it's the mainstay. There's another plant that I won't name that is my link to all of the other awarenesses, shamanic awarenesses or mystical awarenesses. But in terms of like strong and steady and the glue that holds it all together for me is Morosa.
Morosa?
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your favorite plant. Thank you also for sharing your wisdom in this awesome conversation. We could probably talk for like 2 more hours, but our time is up.
Okay.
And I would like to, just really appreciate you and the knowledge that you've held and that you carry and you continue to share. You've taught me a lot over the years. I'm really glad that we're in contact and that we'll stay in contact. And I know that this next phase of whatever happens is going to be a really interesting one, whatever comes out of, you know, after COVID, which isn't over in many parts of the world. Just wanted to note that it's not there yet. Things are still happening. But just grateful for you and your knowledge and your willingness to share it with us today. So thank you so much, Sita.
Yeah, thank you. And once again, I really thank all of my teachers and all of the wisdom of the plants and all of the elements of this great Gaian ecosphere that we get to be a part of. And that includes the internet today. And that includes having this whole virtual connection. And, you know, while it might seem like they're bites and short-lived, the other side of that is that we get to hear from people all over the world and voices that maybe wouldn't have been heard 20 years ago. And so I'm so grateful for that. I'm so grateful to Chakruna for making that possible and for the sacred plants in the Americas to really bring to the forefront indigenous reciprocity and calling us to be more mindful and more conscientious and more responsible. So thank you, Chakruna and Bia, and thank you, Izzy.
Happy to do it. Thank you all for being here. Huge shout out to the sponsors and like the dozens and dozens of volunteers and tech support and hosts. There's a lot of people behind the scenes to make this happen. So I just want to send out like a lot of love and appreciation and gratitude for all the people that were involved in putting this together. And as you said, Sita, it's true. Like this is part of the way that a lot of this knowledge, at least one version of it, does get to, you know, make contact. And maybe through that point of entry, someone ends up with chiggers in the jungle. You know, like who knows? So much love, much appreciation. Thank you everyone for sticking it out with the conference. Pass on to the main stage for the closing and sending you all a lot of love. Have a great rest of your night.
Okay, bye.